Hello. I'd like to begin this video message with a public service announcement from my good friend, George Clooney.
Hi, I'm actor, director, and two-time sexiest man alive, George Clooney. Science has given us unprecedented knowledge of the natural world, from subatomic particles to the majesty of space. Science enables us to cure diseases, to communicate across great distances, even to fly. Tragically, though, the volumes of invaluable knowledge gathered over centuries are now threatened by an epidemic of dumb idiots saying dumb.
You know what this is? It's a snowball. So it's very, very cold out.
Dumb is highly contagious, infecting the minds of even the most stable geniuses.
If you have a windmill anywhere near your house, they say the noise causes cancer. You tell me that one, okay?
Wow. As a result, rampant dumb now threatens our health, our security, and our planet. Fortunately, there is hope. At United to Defeat Untruthful Misinformation and Support Science. You Dumbass. Your generous contribution to You Dumbass will provide desperately needed knowledge to dumb idiots on Facebook and Twitter all around the world. Just $20 will convince one idiot that climate change is real. $50 will teach 5 brainless dumb to vaccinate their kids. And $200 will teach 10 knuckle draggers that dinosaurs existed, but not at the same time as people. Together, we can win the fight against dumb-ness, but we can't do it alone. Call this number today. Operators are standing by. Don't be an idiot. The world needs your support. You dumbass.
Thank you, George. Last week, in my introduction to our unit on the long 60s, I showed you the map that was the inspiration for George Clooney's public service announcement. Do you remember this map? It's a meme from the 2008 presidential election year. It portrays the United States as being two countries: America, where all right-thinking people live, and Dumbfuckistan, which is where people who don't believe in science and chew a lot of tobacco, that's where they live. Nobody likes to be called a dumb fuck. I don't know if you found George Clooney's PSA funny or just hugely annoying. But both sides in the culture war like to make fun of the other. If it's not dumb fucks, then it's labeling the other side environmental freaks and quiche eaters and welfare bums. This side, the red state side, pictures the middle and southern part of the country as the only legitimate parts of the United States, the part where Republicans and real Americans live. This culture war is, in my view, the number one fact of our time. When I say number one fact, I mean the number one social, cultural, and political fact that needs to be explained historically. This unit on the long 60s is an attempt to do that. The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed America's weaknesses, as only a time of national crisis can. It showed us that our public health system was in a shambles. It showed us that the national pride in independence and self-reliance can sometimes come back to bite us when large numbers of Americans do not heed the advice of experts and governmental authorities. More than anything else, though, COVID-19 has pulled back the covers on the weaknesses caused by the extreme polarization that marks American society since the 1960s, and the loss of trust in government, and in institutions, and in each other. We're stuck in a time of culture war, and this moment of national crisis has not done what previous moments of crisis were able to do: bring the country together in the interests of national unity. In fact, the coronavirus has become just another battleground in our ongoing culture wars. This seems like a good time to be asking ourselves questions about how we got to this place and what we might do about it looking forward to the future. Our unit is called the Long 60s because, in my view, the United States never left the 60s. And we've been stuck in a time of extreme political and cultural polarization ever since at least 1968. Our quizzes last week over Jill Lepore and Howard Zinn's chapters on the 60s are followed this week by a quiz over their final chapters, which continue the story from the 1970s to the present. So, I'd like to start my video message this week with a few words about the quizzes. In my mind, when I imagine how these quizzes should work, I see a graph that looks something like this. At the beginning of the course, almost nobody knows how to read complex and dense and demanding text to find the author's main point. But as they begin to practice, as we take quiz after quiz, as I help people teaching how to find the main point, quiz scores get better week by week until at some point, slightly over halfway into the course, everybody is making a perfect quiz score every time. In my head, those are the quiz scores that I want to see. But I never see that. Here's an average quiz scores from all the classes that I've taught going back about 17 years. Put all the scores together and the graph looks something like this. Yeah, at the beginning of the course, very few people know how to read for the main point. They put a lot of effort into the early quizzes and they get better right away. And then there's a mid-course slump as people turn their attention to other things. But by the end of the course, just about every time, most people are able to read for the main point and do well on those quizzes. That's the actual average of all the quiz scores I've given over the years. And how did you do, or how have you done so far with one quiz left to go? Your quiz averages have been most interesting to me. Here in spring 2020, I noticed a couple of things. Yes, we do have the mid-course slump just like always, but it's not at the same level as always. You guys scored incredibly high on the early quizzes compared to my past classes. You had a little bit of a slump, but then you climbed out of it, and on the last two quizzes have done very well. We have one more quiz to go, and wouldn't it be great if the class average on this last quiz was a perfect 400? In my mind, that's what I'm shooting for, and I wish you the best as you shoot for it too. Now, a couple of things to say about this week's quiz. Two things. First, it's not on Friday to Sunday this week. We're bumping it up because we don't really have a unit this week with things to do. This week's unit continues last week's on the long 60s as the story continues into the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. So the quiz this week happens starting at Tuesday noon and going to Wednesday at midnight. You'll have a little over 24 hours to take the quiz. The second thing you need to know about this quiz has to do with the Howard Zinn book. You're being quizzed over 2 chapters in Howard Zinn, and I'm going to take the liberty of considering those 2 chapters to be one long chapter. Zinn's book was published in 1980, I want to say, and then he, over the years, added chapters as more history came to pass. And so these final chapters of his are shorter than the earlier chapters, and it begins to start making the similar points in each of the chapters. So I think it's possible to read 2 chapters in Zinn and see one single main point uniting both chapters. And that's what you'll be quizzed on starting tomorrow at noon. Now the other project here in week, 14? Here in week 12, 3 weeks to go. The other project is what I creatively call the final assignment. Now, back when we were meeting face-to-face, this wasn't part of our course. We were going to end the course with some debates, but since we can't do that, I've gone back to an oldie but goodie from earlier versions of this course. This final assignment asks you to imagine that you're a staff member for a real-life organization called the National Council of History Education. I used to sit on their board, so I'm familiar with this organization. And I'm asking you to imagine that the NCHE wants to send one work of history out to every adult American in order to increase our civic education and literacy as citizens. Suppose they had asked you, as an intern or staff member for the organization, to write them a memo telling them which of these two books was the better history. What would you say? That's our final assignment. And I've got some suggestions for you on how to write this essay, but before I go over those, I would like to answer a very important question, which is why this kind of an assignment? It goes back to the big questions of our course, which I outlined for you on day one. We have three big questions. The first one is, what is the story of American history? The second one was, when historians are telling stories, making sense of the past, how do they draw distinctions between good stories and bad ones? Between plausible stories that might be true and implausible stories that couldn't possibly be true? How do they draw those distinctions? And much of our course has been training in the heuristics that historians use to tell the difference between a good story and a bad story that makes sense of the past. We had a third question too, which you can't see on your screen, and it was, how can historical thinking help me in my career, in my life as a citizen and as a human being? Well, I have designed this final assignment in such a way that your knowledge of the answers to these three questions are going to be on display. So this final assignment assesses everything that you've learned in this course and gives you an opportunity to put it out there for yourself to look at. What is the story of American history? In week 2, I floated the idea that there aren't that many stories people have told to make sense of the American past. And we looked at the stories that I think are the leading candidates for being sensible stories. There's the glory story. There's a gory story. There's Howard Zinn's story of the people versus the elites. There's a story called High Ideals, Mixed Results. And there's the Out of Many One story that was a favorite of our president before Donald Trump, Barack Obama. And then finally there are cycles of war, cycles of private interest and public interest, etc., that sometimes people have told to make sense of the American past. We've read 2 books in this course. That's 2 is sort of an arbitrary number. We could have read 5 books, but I don't think any of us would have had it in us to do that. So I picked 2 books telling 2 of these stories, and we have spent this semester evaluating what these historians have to say. The story of America is something you're going to be running into for the rest of your life. Presidents always have stories that they use to try to explain to the country what they think needs to be done. Most people commenting on public affairs have some story of America in their heads that makes sense of the American past and tells us what we should do next. You'll be bumping into, engaging with, debating stories about the American past for the rest of your life. And therefore, I made one of the signature questions of our course, what is that story? The best story to make sense of the American past. Everybody has a story, except for young college students. My research over the last 20 years has shown that while the glory story, which was once the most popular story told by my students, the glory story is almost told by nobody anymore. In our section of History 131 here this spring, only a single person out of 27 students had a glory story to tell at the beginning of the course. The section of these bars that's dark charcoal gray signifies a story that's really not a story at all. A story of just one event after another event without any coherence to any of it, or any meaning, or any pattern. Just one damn thing after another. That no story has become increasingly common among my college students, and I believe elsewhere too, over the last 20 years. So when our course is asked, what is the story of American history? Part of what I'm up to here is to give you an opportunity to decide whether you think the United States has a story that makes sense of its past. I hope you do. I hope either Howard Zinn or Jill Lepore has registered with you, at least this far, to make you want to look for a story that makes sense of the American past. It says in the Old Testament book of Proverbs, where there is no vision, the people perish. A society without a story to make sense of itself, to itself, is a society that has no future, because it's in stories that human beings get a sense of who they are and what they're supposed to do. What's the best story to make sense of the American past? Our final assignment asks you to evaluate two historians and tell the National Council for History Education which one's telling the better story. Is it Howard Zinn, whose book I chose because he's such a cultural icon in the last 50 years? More people have read his history than any other history written over the last 75 years. Is he telling the better story, or is it Jill Lepore, whose story was written and published just 2 years ago and is probably the most talked about history of the United States in our present moment? This week, you'll be again working on your final assignment. You'll be writing a draft that's due this Sunday at midnight. I'll be commenting on the draft next week, giving you pointers and advice, and then you'll have roughly 10 days until Friday of week 14 at noon to turn in your final draft. The essay that you write needs to do two things. It needs to summarize the story told by both of our historians, Howard Zinn and Jill Lepore. In the handout that you'll see on Moodle, I tell you where to look in these books to find succinct summaries of the stories that the historians are telling. For Howard Zinn, it's in the early pages of his book, where he explains what his viewpoint is in telling the history of the United States of America. Jill Lepore summarizes her story in her introduction, and again in her epilogue. You'll find her story there. So that's the first thing your draft this week has to do, is accurately and comprehensively summarize the story told by these two historians. The second thing you need to do is evaluate those stories. The handout that you'll find on Moodle with directions for this assignment will give you some pointers for how to go about assessing who do you think is telling the better story. You'll probably want to do some research into the backgrounds of these two historians because, and you've heard this before, if you want to know the history, first you got to know the historian. And by now you even know the heuristic that this motto refers to. It's the sourcing heuristic. Anytime that you're reading or listening to information, you need to know who's talking to you in order to properly assess the credibility and relevance of the speaker, writer, or author. Who's telling the better history? I'm looking forward to reading your thoughts on this and to helping you next week write an even better draft of this essay than the first draft. As always, I'm just an email or a video chat away if you have questions or want to bounce ideas off my head this week. But that's all I've got for now. Quiz on Tuesday, Wednesday, and your rough draft of the final assignment turned into me on Moodle by Sunday at midnight. Bye now.